Hi, I'm Susan Hutton. I am the Executive Director of the Lummi Island Heritage Trust, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the third in our speaker series this year to introduce you to Amanda Monthei, who is going to talk to us about Westside Wildfire. We are recording this via Zoom, and the excellent Kendra Schmiedeskamp is going to be monitoring questions on Zoom. And if anyone in the audience has questions, we will make sure to ask Amanda to repeat them so that people on Zoom will also be able to hear them. So we will all be able to participate, whether you're in the room with us or not. I also wanted to make sure to thank Lummi Island Carmels for their generous support of this event and for a lot of the work that we do, and to tell them how much we appreciate all of their support. Last fall, when we were wrapped in wildfire smoke, my husband suddenly started to articulate the nuances of what we were seeing and smelling, what was causing it and why, and to narrate what would likely happen in the next days. He also shared the source of his newfound knowledge, a woman he had begun to follow on Twitter, a former wildland firefighter living in Bellingham named Amanda Monthei. I started to follow her on Twitter too, and I started to listen to her podcast, Life with Fire. From the people she interviewed and the articles she wrote, I began to get a much clearer understanding of the strange and frightening sun we saw for much of October, and the haze that has started to become what we recognize as the Northwest summer sky. When we were putting together our 2023 speaker series, Amanda's name was at the top of my list. Fire is a powerful presence in our lives, of course. It is an elemental force of nature, the basis of our associations with safety and warmth, and a metaphor for our significant experiences. We're all aware of these qualities of fire, but we are less likely to recognize how fire is ingrained into the places we love. Not just the threat it carries to our homes and our families, but the way people who lived here long before us used it to shape the places we know and love. Amanda Monthei explores this question in an essay she wrote for adventure.com. What does, quote, natural actually mean when the natural world is and always has been shaped by human hands? Our modern relationship with nature hasn't necessarily been defined by coexistence, but does that change the fact that human behavior and ecosystem vitality are deeply and enduringly interwoven? Sure, the land would probably be fine if humans ceased to exist, but while we're here, we might as well make peace with reality. We've lost touch with the stewardship required for balance, and our ecosystems are reflecting this change by increasingly extreme means. I hope that we will all leave tonight with information we can use to protect and steward this island, to achieve such a balance, and to take care of ourselves and each other and the beautiful land we love. Amanda Monthei spent 4 years working as a wildland firefighter for the Forest Service, including 2 seasons on a hotshot crew. In 2020, she started the podcast Life with Fire. She also works as a wildland public information officer and writes for publications like the Washington Post, The Atlantic, and Patagonia. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Monthei.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for that spectacular introduction. That was awesome. I forgot that I had written that story. And so when you started reading my words back to me, I was like, wait a minute, where did this come from again? So thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It is an admittedly sort of heavy topic, but I think it's becoming more and more somewhat unescapable in terms of, our collective consciousness. We're seeing more smoke every summer. We're seeing these fires that are impacting almost our backyards. I think increasingly so. We're seeing these fires that are kind of creeping up towards Whatcom County, and it's becoming more of a thing. And so I'm here to kind of talk about my own experiences and why I became interested in wildfire. And those were primarily through my experiences on fire crews. And then after I kind of talk about my experience with working in fire, I'll talk about what we're seeing in terms of trends on the west side of the Cascades and kind of what we can come to expect, or how we can maybe mentally prepare ourselves for somewhat living with fire over here in an area that we don't normally associate with fire. So starting out, Like I said, I'm going to start out with some experiences I had on the hotshot crew that I worked on. I started out in fire in 2016. I worked in Idaho for a season, northern Idaho, up near Priest Lake. And then I worked in central Idaho on a hand crew for a season in 2017, kind of in like the Middle Fork salmon, or like really the Salmon River breaks was the area that I called home that summer. And it was spectacular, if not like very humbling in terms of the landscape we were in. It was very steep, very rugged, but I ended up on a hotshot crew my last 2 seasons. Hotshot crews are, the word elite is always thrown around when referring to hotshot crews. I think that's like a little bit too much, but nonetheless, you know, these are the crews that are kind of tasked with getting put into some of the more intense areas on fires, whether that's more intense terrain or more intense fire behavior, or just places that need a lot more sort of qualifications from a crew in order to sort of safely deal with things operationally. So for me, that experience really became, it was a lot of, I was very green, you know, I was like only 3 years into fire when I got onto a hotshot crew. My overhead, my supervisors were all very, very talented and had a lot of qualifications. And so it was a very profound learning environment, I'll just say. But what that ended up often looking like was performing things like burnouts, where we were burning out fuel between where we would establish a line on like a road or on a trail, and then burning the fuel along that road so that it created a more robust buffer against the approaching fire. That was a task that we were very often responsible for. And then other than that, it was often digging fire lines to effectively remove the fuel from the ground so that when the fire met that line, it would stop. And that was like not only hand tools, like digging a trail effectively, but also using chainsaws to cut out trees and thicker vegetation like that. So that was kind of what my day-to-day looked like. I would say that was probably, those two tasks were probably 25% of the time I spent on crews. The rest of it was like a lot of the non-glorious stuff of like putting your hands in the dirt and just making sure it's cold. That took up a lot more of our time than the fun, glorious stuff. But nonetheless, that was what I ended up doing a lot of. This was my crew was based on Mount Hood National Forest, but we ended up traveling all over. These are a few photos I just had to include. I don't know why, just to like show you that this was in fact a thing I did. But nonetheless, on the right was a photo taken in Leavenworth on the Cougar Creek fire in 2018. And then on the left is from the Dollar Ridge fire in Utah, and also in 2018. 2018 was a very, very busy season for us. We spent most of our time, you know, there's like a rotation, or there's like a cyclical nature, I guess, of fire seasons. And you learn to figure it out, where you're like, okay, in the spring, we do prescribed burning. And I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But after that, we go to the Southwest, to Arizona, New Mexico. That's what burns early in the season in May and June. After that, you go to Utah in July. After that, you go to Oregon and Washington in August and September. You learn to figure out like the seasonality, the sort of micro seasonality of a fire season after a while. So this was taken in July, the one on the left here in Utah, and this was taken in August in Leavenworth in 2018. That was my busiest fire season. We would call we call it a 1,000-hour season. If we get 1,000 hours of overtime, that's an indication that you had a really busy season. That's kind of like listen, I got 1,000 hours of overtime this year. Like, you know that they worked really, like you worked on a lot of fires if you hit that sort of milestone. So that's just like a common milestone that you talk about. And that was my only season of hitting it. And oh my God, was it the busiest summer of my life. I think we went out on 8 or 9 fires, and we're going out for 2 weeks at a time. So 14-day assignments, sometimes a little bit longer, up to like 21, 22 occasionally. And you're just sleeping on the ground and not taking showers and eating food from like, these trucks that, it's kind of like a hot lunch from an elementary school, it seems like most of the time. And so I was talking about prescribed burning. That's kind of what the spring looks like for us, especially in the Northwest. We do a lot of prescribed burning in April, May, June, sometimes March if we can get the right conditions, but you're looking for kind of a very specific set of conditions for this. You don't want the wind to be ripping. You don't want the fuel to be too dry, the vegetation to be too dry. So you're kind of looking for these really sort of moderate conditions. You want the fire to burn because the purpose of prescribed burning is to somewhat mimic the historical presence of fire in landscapes that need that. So in this landscape, for example, this is the Colville National Forest. In this area with this type of tree, you would maybe expect to see fire every 5 to 35 years. So that's like generally what would have happened naturally or anthropogenically via indigenous burning. That's what this landscape, this ecosystem would have been adapted to. And so prescribed burning is just mimicking that natural sort of process. You're going in, you're using drip torches, which is like a mix of diesel and gas. And then you light the wick on the end, and you just drip ignited fuel until somebody tells you to stop. And this is the result of that. And this is actually a very good example, I think, of what a prescribed fire kind of should look like around here. It's kind of burning some of the ground fuel. It's not really getting up into trees. Occasionally it will. You are still looking for a few trees to burn in these situations, not obviously all of them, but maybe like 5 or 10% of the trees. And this is kind of what we're talking about. Pretty good fire behavior here, I would say. It's on the ground, like I said. It's kind of pulling, we would say pulling in. The fire's pushing it in towards itself. The fire's not, the wind isn't pushing it towards our line, which is where I'm standing. The fire, it might seem like really intense, but the fire behavior is pretty mellow here. It's just kind of like, it's on the ground, it's creeping around. If we got some wind on that, it might pick up and move a little bit, but right at this exact moment, it's looking pretty good. Just a standard, like a photo of us hiking off of a fire. I'll quickly explain kind of like what things looked like out there. We were often on this fire, we were flown into this ridge line, and we spent like, I think 7 days, we call it spiked out. And so basically we didn't have any real resources. They would fly us food. They would fly us in food via helicopter, but we were up on this ridge line, kind of in a place that you would have to hike a long ways to get to otherwise. And we couldn't really hike in because of these sort of steep scree-ish slopes that you can see on the other side of the valley there. Pretty hard hiking territory. And so they just flew us in, and then we just dug some line, and we kind of kept an eye on things on the part of the fire that was up in that zone. And we do a lot of hiking, and you can see, we have saws, and this big box here is a cubie. It's full of water. And so we have extra water available throughout the day if we need it. I'm just like, I don't know how much you guys know about these fire crews and about how it kind of operates. So I wanted to give you guys like a quick rundown of how this all goes. This is more intense fire behavior. And this is actually a burnout that just burned a little bit hot, but it still effectively did what we wanted it to do, which was that it burned enough of the fuel out that when the main fire hit this road, it didn't like blast over into what we would call the green, which is the other side of the road there. Yeah, a little more intense. As you can see, we have some crowning. It's like burning entire trees, but it did what it was supposed to do, even if it looks really intense. And it was very intense and hot right here. And we didn't mean for that to happen, but it did. And it worked ultimately. We burned a few too many trees there, but it ultimately saved kind of the other side of the road. It did effectively stop the fire at that point, which was the ultimate objective. And this is a lot of what we were actually seeing most of the time, I would say. And so this is kind of what you're looking at when the fire burns through an area, and then you're kind of preparing to start mop up where you're going in, and you're just kind of like putting water on it and digging around with your tool, maybe like putting your hands in the dirt to make sure it's cold. This is a majority of, I think, the work that we were doing. It's not all like super glorious. It's just kind of watching things and making sure they're not going anywhere. Let's go to the next one, actually. And then just to make a transition into the second half of my talk, which is going to be more about kind of like how climate change is impacting wildfires on the west side and wildfire in general, and kind of some other things. This was a fire that I was on in Wyoming in I think it was mid-October 2018, and we were at 8,500 feet of elevation. So this is subalpine firs. and it is just moving. This is like probably a 200, 300 foot flame length, like the most intense fire behavior I've ever seen. And like I said, this is like a part of the season where you would expect to be getting snow and rain, and you'd expect it to be pretty cold and pretty moist and kind of like a transition towards winter. But instead we were seeing these like really, really intense, this really intense fire behavior that I would say is very unseasonable for mid to late October in Wyoming at that elevation. So I think that was, that's my kind of transition point towards talking about the ways that climate change is sort of impacting the way that fires burn. That was, like I said, that was the wildest experience I think I've ever had, was sitting there from this close and feeling the heat from that flaming, like that crown fire basically. And being able to, and seeing this with my own eyes was pretty wild. So thankfully we aren't, I can't really say that we aren't seeing fires like this on the west side. I'll talk about it a little bit, but in fact, like this is what you would, when I say high severity fire, this is a good visual to have when I say high severity fire, because this is very much, it's a crown fire. We have really high flame lengths. It's probably resulting in a significant amount of tree mortality. And that's kind of what I mean when I'm saying like high severity or stand replacing fire. And then before we get into west side, I just want to like point out what an east side ecosystem looks like. It's primarily ponderosa pine and Doug fir dominated ecosystems. The photo on the right is Bend, Oregon. The photo on the left is near Leavenworth. So you can see that there's a little bit, the difference here with east side ecosystems is, like I mentioned, you have that like 2 to 20 year fire frequency interval. And basically what that means is that naturally, historically, they would have been seeing fire in these ecosystems really frequently within that 2 to 20 year time frame. On the west side, our fire frequency interval is more like 200 to 700 years. And so historically, we would have been seeing huge stand replacing fires every roughly 400 to 500 years, kind of on average. Sometimes more frequently, sometimes less frequently, but you're not seeing fire every 15 to 20 years like you would be on the east side. So you can see how that might affect the landscape. And so on the right side, you can see there's not a lot of dense brush. It doesn't look anything like a west side forest. I'm sure you guys have gone hiking. If you've gone hiking on the mainland, like in any of the wilderness areas or in any of the popular hiking areas, kind of on the other side of Seattle there, still on the west side of the Cascades, it's going to be super dense. And even in Bellingham, like you cannot probably walk through it. And then you look at something like the east side and it looks like a park, like you can see clearly for 100, 200, 300 feet because there's no brush kind of obscuring your view. So that's what I mean kind of when I talk about like a lower or a higher frequency fire regime, is something like this. It's seeing fire very frequently, and there's not a lot of vegetation on the ground, and the trees are very fire adapted because they see fires so frequently. So that, on the contrary, is our west side forests. And as I've mentioned, it's a very different cycle over here. We don't see fire very often. When we do see fire, it's going to be like very, very intense. And I think there's some good indications of that. I don't know if you guys remember the Labor Day fires. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but in 2020, we had these really intense fires that burned on Labor Day weekend. I'll talk about it a bit in a few slides here, but just as an indication of what West Side fires kind of look like, that's a really good visualization to have in your mind. Is fast moving, often stand replacing, often quite catastrophic on an ecological level, but it's hard to say exactly that it is catastrophic because it's also adapted to that kind of fire. And so it might be catastrophic on a human scale in terms of like recreational value or cultural value, or, maybe there was infrastructure that was impacted, or certainly if there were homes impacted or lives impacted. But on an ecological level, these forests are used to kind of burning that intensely, stand replacing, and then coming back. And, some of the more profound old growth stands, if you take tree ring samples on those trees, you're going to see that they experienced these really significant fires every 200 to 300 years. And then that was burning out all of the sort of underbrush, some of the competition that allowed for the proliferation of some of our best old growth, or some of our most robust old growth. So it might feel catastrophic. These fires on our side of the Cascades might feel really catastrophic, sort of at a human level, at a human scale. But ecologically, a lot of the time that they're burning well within kind of the historical norm for what we would expect over here. And I think that's something that maybe a lot of folks don't realize, is just how the fires that we are seeing are often, we can blame a lot of the fire problems on the east side, or really around the rest of the country, on mismanagement. I think that's probably something we all hear often, is the forests were mismanaged. But on the west side of the Cascades, you almost mask that mismanagement with a very, very long fire interval. So you don't see as much, there's not as much opportunity over here for thinning and prescribed burning and the sort of traditional strategies that we would use to bring that fuel loading down. Because the forests here just are full of fuel and vegetation, and they always have been, and they likely always will be, because it's very wet and very conducive to growing. So there's your quick and dirty on Westside sort of fire history and what you can expect to see over here. But as we move into kind of the current moment, so not only with the Labor Day fires, but with the Bolt Creek fire last year and some of the other fires that have been burning on this side of the mountains, what we're seeing as far as trends is that we always, the three ingredients that we need to have these fires occur are an ignition source, whether that's lightning or human caused. Human caused can be incidental, accidental, arson, like where humans exist, there will be accidental starts, almost assuredly. There's always going to be people that accidentally leave a chain dangling off the back of their trailer, or I don't know, there's just so many different ways that we humans can start fires. And it's, the more concentration of folks you have in these areas that are susceptible to wildfires, the more likelihood you are of getting these accidental emissions, kind of no matter, or ignitions rather, kind of no matter how much prevention work you do. It just happens, unfortunately. So we can't necessarily count on a future where we don't have ignitions, because as long as folks live in these places, you're gonna get those ignitions. So if we have an ignition source, if we have that prolonged drought like we saw last summer, where we didn't see any rain from, I think, June until the end of October, very little rain anyway, that's a huge red flag. And that's why a lot of our fires take place in August and September. A lot of them start in that time period, because it takes that long for all of this fuel to dry out. It takes 3-4 months of prolonged drought for that to happen. But that still means that if we're not getting those sort of seasonal rains in September and early October, then we have a really heightened fire risk for an additional however many weeks, 3, 4, 5 weeks, much like last summer. And then we have an east wind event. And this is actually a pretty essential ingredient to most of the fires that have taken place on the west side that have been quote unquote catastrophic. I think the Labor Day fires were a great example of, great being, I don't know, I guess subjective, but a very good example of these three elements combining and creating very historic fire conditions. This stat of 620,000 acres burned in just Washington State in 3 days alone. That's a staggering amount of acreage. And that is how these forests burn. They burn hot, they burn fast. If they have the right conditions, and those conditions you might only have those conditions for a day or two, but if you have those conditions in place and you have the ignitions, you're going to see some pretty insane fire spread. And that's what we saw over the Labor Day fires. So that 620,000 acre figure is more than double what we would normally average annually for acreage burned in Washington State. And that happened double our annual average happened in 72 hours. That's a pretty staggering amount of acreage. But from what we can see of past fires, things like the Tillamook fire in the 1930s, and a few other fires that we have sort of a little bit of an analog for. So I guess those fires provide an analog to understand that the fires that we see on this side of the mountains are always going to just be these big sort of conflagrations if they have those conditions in place, if they have that east wind especially. The reason the east wind is especially profound in this, or especially needed in these fires, is that they bring that dry air from the east side of the mountains. So obviously Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington are much, much drier. And so when you get these east wind events that bring 40, 50 mile an hour winds up and over the mountains with this really dry air, it just fans whatever's already on the ground. So you can have a 12-acre fire or a 200-acre fire, which are, small by most people's definition, and you get an east wind on it and it can become 10, 15, 20,000 acres in a course of a couple hours. So these east wind events are what is ultimately, I think, driving the rapid growth of the fires that we're seeing over here, if those other conditions are already in place. And then, yeah, I mean, so the conditions, what was I going to say? Yeah. Oh, I was going to say the drought conditions. So when we talk about like how climate change is impacting fire behavior and how fires burn over here, I would say the drought more so than the east wind events. I don't know that they've necessarily connected, the prevalence of east wind events to climate change. I don't know that they will be able to do that. I'm not really sure, but it is fairly well known now that like these extended prolonged droughts that are becoming more of the norm. Some years we have them, some years we don't. These are things that they're kind of directly attributing to climate change. And these are also, it's one of those ingredients that's going to become more prevalent. So as we have more prevalence of these prolonged droughts, as we have more people living in these places where accidental ignitions might become more possible, and then you just get that random 2 days of east wind events, then that's how these big extreme fires happen over here. So like I said, like I've repeated, it's a rare kind of day or week where these conditions can align. But the growing prevalence of the drought problem is, I think, going to increase the possibility of these things happening, and of the possibility and the potential being there for more of these things to happen. So that's kind of what we've got to look out for. As I said, climate change driven drought patterns is for sure a problem over here. The amount of people living in these fire adapted ecosystems. I think a lot of folks don't realize that the West Side is a fire adapted ecosystem. So fire does belong in this landscape, even if that means that it's only coming in every 200 or 500 or 700 years. It still means that these landscapes require fire to a certain degree. And that, in whether or not we understand that on a human timescale, I think it's really easy to live in an area and think, well, my grandparents lived here, my great-grandparents lived here, and we've never seen a fire. We've never seen a fire in this area. That doesn't necessarily align with the reality of how sort of fire prone some of these landscapes can be. It's really hard to realize or to prepare for something that feels really like not possible or not probable, but as we saw with Labor Day, the Labor Day fires, there were a lot of communities in Oregon, for example, that were really deeply impacted, that hadn't seen fire in probably 300, 400 years. And so people didn't realize just how at risk they were. And I think it's very obvious that problem can creep north very easily as we see more impacts of climate change, and as we see temperatures increasing and drought increasing and things like that. So I mentioned this earlier, but fire exclusion, so the act of suppressing wildfires and then not kind of doing the proper work to mimic the process of wildfire on a landscape. So that would be prescribed fire or thinning. Those things are a uniquely not Western Washington problem. It's almost anywhere else in the country that you go, you can pretty much blame some sort of management issue in terms of the way that fires burn in those landscapes. On the West Side, it's a lot harder to separate that out, and it's a lot murkier of a line. I think that in a lot of places, certainly they could use more fire. Certainly fire suppression hasn't helped, but in most cases, it's hard to definitively say that this landscape is the way that it is because of fire suppression, because realistically, it's probably just that way because it only burns every 600 years here, and we don't know, the last time it burned. So something to think about. It's a very unique ecosystem in terms of that element of not really being able to blame land management issues. And the flip of that, the other side of that coin is that we can't use the strategies that we would use elsewhere to mitigate our risk. So, you know, you think about any place that you would go hiking, pretty much anywhere in Western Washington, and it's impossible to think about how much manpower it would take to reduce the fuel loading in some of these places. It's too dense. There's too many trees. It would just take so many man hours. It would take so much chainsaw work to do the fuel mitigation that we would need. And it's not feasible. And I think that's becoming more broadly accepted, that prescribed fire and thinning is just not very feasible in these forests over here. And so the options that we have available to us are somewhat limited. And so it's kind of, it's a point of a lot of research right now. UW is doing a lot of research on this, trying to figure out kind of what we can do. But it's becoming more widely accepted that our traditional strategies for dealing with fuel loading are not super feasible over here, because, you know, we're in other places like in Eastern Washington, you're looking at these landscape level fuels treatment projects where you're protecting a community by doing a buffer. You're dealing with that landscape I showed earlier where there's not a ton of vegetation to deal with as it is. And it's a little easier to work with things over there. Over here, you know, you can do some defensible space. Maybe you can do some of those little buffers around community areas, around neighborhoods. But the sort of more landscape level, like the more, you know, using entire ridge lines to protect a community or something like that is a little less feasible. So kind of a repeat of what I said earlier. Definitely pretty good wake up call with the Labor Day fires. I think a lot of folks, that really did kind of clarify to a lot of folks that this is a problem, whether or not we have to, you know, whether or not this is something that keeps occurring every year or something that we only have to maybe think about dealing with every decade. It's impossible to know how often these are going to become a problem, how often we're going to have to deal with fires like what we saw on Labor Day of 2020. So I guess really it's like, you know, whether or not we know how frequently this is going to occur, we do need to start making some preparations and start doing some, you know, some resilience building and start thinking about this stuff more and talking about it more. This is all kind of a repeat. Yeah. So I worked on the Bolt Creek fire, and this is what Susan was talking about with the Twitter thread that I wrote. I was a PIO, a public information officer on the Bolt Creek fire for about a week and a half. And this was a really interesting fire to work on. And I was one of two public information officers almost the entire time I was there. It was a very high intensity fire. It was funny because by most people's standards, it was not that intense of a fire. It was kind of moving pretty slow when I was on it. But it was also dumping tons of smoke into a major metro area. So that made it very complicated from an information standpoint. I was constantly on the news talking to people about, or talking to reporters and trying to drill it home that we can't really fight fire in this landscape, in this terrain. So you can see this was, I believe, this was like the last 4 or 5 days I was there. This is what the fire was doing. I didn't take this photo, somebody from the fire did. And it was on the backside of this mountain, and it was in, I don't remember the name of the wilderness area, but it was in a wilderness area. After it crested over the mountain, it was effectively into a wilderness area. It was in an area that they would have had to fly people into, and they weren't going to do that. And I was talking to Susan and a few other folks earlier about this. I like being on incident command teams where it's very clear that firefighter safety is as much of a factor in determining management strategies as suppressing the fire. And so on this fire, it was very clear that firefighter safety was important. It was probably the top priority. Last summer, we had a number of fatalities in the fire community. Most firefighters who die on line die from falling trees. And you can see how, you know, you have a fire that burns at a high severity. It burns out the root structures of these trees. Very easy for these things to fall over. Very difficult to mitigate that risk. So there's a lot of risk that we can mitigate on the fire line, and thousands of trees being burnt out at the bases is not really one of them. Unfortunately, we can do the best we can if we have like a road to work off of, but dropping folks off in the middle of this wilderness area to like try to put this fire out was not something that they were interested in doing. So the fire just burned. And unfortunately, that meant that it was putting a lot of smoke into Seattle. And that is an incredibly unfortunate human impact that I personally, I probably don't talk about it enough. I think, I often talk about human impacts being infrastructure impacts, home impacts, obviously impacts to like, people losing their lives, things like that. Smoke is a significant human impact though. And but there unfortunately is going to be very little that we can do about the increasing likelihood of smoky summers in the future, just because we're almost paying a debt back at this point. We're indebted to the lack of fire in some of these ecosystems. And so with situations like this, where we're not going to put people into that fire to suppress it, the unfortunate reality is that we're just going to have this smoke going into the air. And just, it's worth acknowledging just how many vulnerable populations this impacts, outdoor laborers, like children, elderly, the homeless population. There are so many people, there are so many populations that don't have access to a nice forced air HVAC system, or don't have access to clean air shelters or things like that. So I think a big part of preparing for and building resilience to fire in our area is going to be ensuring that the folks that need clean air can get it and know where to find it, and that those resources are available to them and made very clear to them. Making sure that schools, especially maybe community centers, have forced air, have ways that they can filter the air so that they can create a clean air shelter, so people can know where to go so that they can breathe well. So there's a lot of vulnerable communities, and I think that's something that gets overlooked often with smoke, especially, is just how vulnerable some communities are. Like I said, the folks that don't have forced air, the folks that don't have filtration systems in their homes. There's a lot of them, and there's a lot of people that are deeply impacted by this element of living with fire. So I don't have all the solutions to it. What I can say is I think clean air shelters are a really important step, making sure that there are a lot of them, making sure that they are well known by community members who need them. And then just making sure that as community members, we're advocating for those spaces and doing what we can to create clean air shelters. So that was my little spiel on that. But yeah, conditions are changing. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, Bolt Creek fire. This is, like I said, this is west of Stevens Pass. So another thing about this image is it shows really well what high severity fire looks like, high intensity fire. The scarring you can see here, like all of the black that you see here, would have burned on day one. So the ignition of the fire was behind the photo, the person taking the photo. I don't know how far behind, but it would have started down here. And then with that east wind, it would have blown up this pass, or excuse me, this valley. And that burned, I believe, 75, I think it burned 8,000 acres in one day, which is pretty significant. And it's, again, especially like, in places that we perceive to be temperate rainforests, very moist, very mossy, things like that. So it burned like 8,000 acres in a day. And then it kind of like, it did have some more intense burning. I believe when I left the fire, it was at like 14,000 acres. But for a while there, it was just chunking away about 300 acres a day. The reason we can't really put this fire out without people on the ground is that no amount of aircraft can stop this amount of smoke, can stop this amount of burning. You'd have to probably put aircraft on this for like weeks straight, just over and over, like back and forth, just cycling through, because you don't have anybody on the ground to mix it up and do the mop up part of it. That's, the very unglorious part of fighting fire, but you got to like have people down there with their hands in the dirt, making sure that it's out. So that's why fires like this, when they're in an area like that, they're not going to be suppressed immediately, because you're kind of at this point waiting for it to burn itself out effectively. So that was the gist of my Twitter thread. Basically was explaining why these traditional management strategies, these traditional suppression strategies don't really work in a landscape like this. And this was a very unique fire in that it was burning mostly in a wilderness area after it burned its initial, this initial valley here. As soon as it crossed that ridge, it was in a wilderness. And so traditionally, wilderness areas, we're going to let those areas kind of burn. There was nothing nothing at risk to the north. They weren't worried about it going north and burning down any homes or anything. It was kind of just wilderness area for like miles and miles. So it was a good opportunity to allow fire to be introduced into that landscape for the first time in probably 400, 500 years. You kind of got to take those opportunities when you can get them, and especially so in places where you don't have any risks to infrastructure, homes, and things like that. Again, it's kind of a big balance because you always have those impacts of smoke on places like Seattle or Skykomish, but unfortunately, you kind of have to weigh the pros and the cons here. And a big benefit of letting this burn is just, that area is not going to burn again for like 300 years, 400 years, who knows, but it's probably not going to burn again in our lifetime. So that's a benefit. So this is what high severity fire looks like kind of on the ground. This is what it does to the vegetation. This is what you would call sort of a stand replacing fire. These trees are dead. The mortality is going to be pretty significant. 75 to 80% of the trees will have died in this area. And it's the stand replacing element. Another factor of climate change and all of this is that when these trees die and when they are replaced by whatever successional species come in, it's possibly, it's very possible that next species is going to be different than the Doug fir and the cedar that might have taken over this landscape before. Next time it might be just shrubs, or it might be in other places just grassland. And this is something we're seeing in other places, especially in like the Rocky Mountains and in Montana. We're seeing these stand replacing fires coming through, burning all of the vegetation, and then the successional vegetation that comes in afterwards is something completely different. So it's like a conversion, a type change is what we call it. The vegetation type is changing fundamentally, and that's because this vegetation wasn't well adapted to the climate conditions that it was facing at this exact moment when this fire came through. So we're going to potentially see more of that type change in the West Cascades. To what, I'm not exactly sure, but probably like a shrub dominated ecosystem in places that experience high severity fire. So that's another element of the climate part of it, is that when we have ecosystems that aren't adapted to the climate conditions that they're facing, then we might just see different types of vegetation, and that might not be the vegetation that we expect out of places like West Cascades. We don't expect shrubland, we expect big Doug firs and towering red cedars. And so, that does kind of play into the recreational and cultural value of these landscapes a bit too. And then I'm probably just going to repeat myself a bunch here, but these are the takeaways. Yeah, this is totally just going to be repeating myself. So like I said, 200 to 700 years for the west side versus the 2 to 20 year. Sometimes that's up to like 60, 70, depending on where you're at. But on the east side, or in most, a lot of the drier ecosystems. I already mentioned this, thinning and prescribed burning doesn't necessarily work over here on the west side. It's not necessarily like the definitive sort of management tool that we have available to us over here. And I wish I could tell you what our management tool is, but I think that there's still a lot of questions surrounding that. Still a lot of uncertainty surrounding that. I think very generally, they're just kind of encouraging folks to take an individual / community effort towards this, making sure that your own home has defensible space. I love what you guys are doing on the island, even getting rid of invasive species and doing things like that. Like, those are all really important resilience measures. And I think these resilience measures too are applicable across changing climate conditions, whether that's, floodplain problems, like I think building, just generally aiming towards a more resilient communities, more resilient landscapes. That's going to help us, whether we're dealing with floods, whether we're dealing with volcanoes, tsunamis, whatever natural disaster we're dealing with. Having more resilient communities will be helpful towards that. So it should be something we're kind of aiming for, regardless of whether we feel that wildfire is a pressing, pertinent threat right now. Blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I mean, Whatcom County and the San Juans, they are not directly at risk of I mean, I can't say definitively anything, but I would say, like, it doesn't maybe feel like we're directly at risk of wildfires. Obviously we have these potentials. We have those 3 ingredients that we need. It's worth being very cognizant. I think, I also think that conditions are changing in such a way that we maybe can expect to start thinking a little bit more about this, especially on the mainland, especially like in eastern Whatcom County over by Glacier and everything. I do think that this is something that we need to be thinking about. But on Lummi specifically, it's hard to say. I think you guys are doing a great job. It sounds like you guys have some good community preparedness programs going on. Yeah, I'm not sure. I can't say much else about that, but I guess I will talk about a little bit the history of Indigenous burning on the islands is really interesting. And so there was a history of Indigenous burning, especially in like lowland Puget Sound area, like the lowland Puget Sound, oak savannas, some of the prairies, like especially the mouth of the Nooksack, the San Juans. I did a story about Orcas Island and about some of the burning that took place over there. And so some of these like lowland sort of coastal ecosystems would have been burned to encourage the growth of things like camas and huckleberry. Well, not huckleberry, but camas. And then that fire would have crept up into the more timbered areas on some of the islands. And so there is a bit of fire history via Indigenous burning because we don't see a lot of lightning over here. And so some of these historic fires would have started by lightning, but most of them can be attributed to Indigenous burning, which I think is really interesting and something that's not very, very talked about. So not only the mouth of the Nooksack, but all the way down into, I think Olympia has a really robust history of Indigenous burning in that area, in the oak savanna down there. And then on the islands. So I think, yeah, I spoke with a Samish, someone from the Samish tribe, and he was talking about how part of their oral history was that they burned on like very close to the water, and especially so like near mouths of rivers. And part of their oral history was that burning encouraged salmon and steelhead to come back to their home rivers because they could smell, they could like sense the ash in the water. And so they felt that burning close to the water was really encouraging the salmon and steelhead to be able to find their way back to the river mouth, to be able to run up and spawn. So I thought that was an interesting, interesting anecdote, an interesting oral history related to when they were burning and why they were burning. And also very, very much founded in, traditional ecological knowledge, obviously very founded in it's scientifically founded. There we go. That's what I was looking for. Because you just think about more phosphorus, more nitrogen, these are all compounds that are that result from areas that are burned. So you get more phosphorus, more nitrogen. It encourages more growth in the nearshore environment. So it makes a lot of sense from that standpoint as well, that would be the case, that they would be encouraging salmon to come back up to the mouth of these rivers. So, okay. Small anecdote. I just thought it was worth mentioning that there is a very robust history of Indigenous burning in this area. And I think that's important to note and important to know. And quick how to prepare. I've talked this whole time kind of about how wildfire is a presence in this area. So I think just acknowledging that wildfire is something that happens here, and acknowledging that it can become an increasingly common threat in the near future will be pretty important. So just kind of educating yourself, educating your neighbors, talking about resilience measures, talking about the ways that your community can be kind of more resilient to wildfire, more resilient to climate change in general. And then, on the island, I'm not sure how much they encourage defensible space. It seems like maybe a little bit, but certainly worth having defensible space, just making sure that you don't have branches that are directly over your roof or anything really closely abutting your house. Those are just handy things to do anyway, whether or not, for whatever, or regardless of reasoning, it could be good to have those things in place. And then the smoke thing, having those air purifiers, HEPA filters, using recirculate mode on your HVAC system. I thought that was an interesting point. Rather than having it bring air in from outside. So recirculating what you have inside, basically making like a little a clean air shelter of your own, putting towels on the doors, making sure that you're not getting anything, that everything is closed and that you're not getting any smoke in, and having respirators when you do need to go outside. And then I already talked a little bit about the clean air shelter thing, but I think that's something that we can all advocate more for. I think we all saw the very profound impacts of smoke last summer. It was very bad for like 6 weeks. It was it came and went quite a bit. But on the bad days, it was like really bad. And I think that's probably the biggest thing we can start thinking about on this side, whether or not we're directly impacted by wildfires, we're going to continue to be indirectly impacted by that smoke. So yeah, that is what I have for you. I'd love to take questions. Do you guys have anything? That was a lot of information. I tend to talk really fast, so I apologize. Go ahead.
A fire will generally burn uphill, as I understand it.
Yeah.
So if you had a fire that started, say, on the water, on Lummi Island, the terrain significantly, precipitously rises.
Yeah.
From the water. So if we lived on the east side of the island, for instance, I would expect that if a fire got started on the east side, it could potentially travel up the mountain to residential areas rather.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like topography is a major component of how fires move. They move faster uphill, obviously. So if they have that wind element to it, and then in this case, it still is going to require that prolonged drought. So it's going to be like a very specific set of conditions, I think, that would be conducive to something being kind of catastrophic on the island. So it would still require, maybe being in September with no significant rain in a couple months, and you'd have to have some wind on it, and you'd have to have an ignition source kind of at the bottom of the slope. And if the conditions are all there, I wouldn't say that wouldn't be possible. It's just, and it's worth absolutely preparing for that potentially. But you're right, though, that it does move. It moves up. It moves faster uphill. Mm-hmm. Anything online? Cool. Oh my gosh, easy. Anybody else have anything? Go ahead. Actually, I'll go to the back row first.
Well, effective road isn't too full on the blow down of the woods.
Blow down of the woods, yeah. It depends. I would say it depends on how, she asked about getting blowdown out of the woods and how much that would contribute to fire spread in the event that something were to happen in that area. And I would say it would depend on how much other vegetation you have in there. Like if it's pretty cleared out and you have some blowdown, might be worth cutting it out. But yeah, I would say, some of these areas are so dense, that if you have time, if you have the resources, it might be worth just getting in there and cutting out some of that really dense vegetation. And especially so if you have a ton of blowdown that's drying out and dead. And if it's a significant chunk of space that you're concerned about, if it's only a small chunk of land, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on like the home hardening side of this stuff. But if it's just a little bit of blowdown that you're worried about, I wouldn't be super concerned. But if it's like blowdown combined with a bunch of vegetation and blackberry and, a bunch of kind of brushy stuff, then it might be worth getting in there and trying to cut some of that stuff out. Go ahead.
Propane tanks, are they, seems like they would be a danger.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know the exact distance, but yeah, there's like a certain amount of distance that you need to have it from your house. There is, making sure that there's no, if you just have grass around it, like it's still going to get pretty hot. But it's not going to have quite as much radiant heat to potentially have it explode. So clearing out around it as much as you can within 10 to 20 feet, I would say, and making sure that it's just like straight up grass, very low grass. If anything around it is probably a good step. Yeah, it's that's something that I would recommend to somebody who lives in a very fire adapted ecosystem in like the east side, or someone that's very concerned. Around here, maybe less of a concern, but if you have the time and you want to clear that stuff out, I would just say like not having vegetation immediately next to the propane tank is a good move. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Go ahead.
Are there statistics on what percentage of human caused versus other types of wildfire?
Yeah, I think it's something in the West, it's something like 96% are human caused. And that's not arson, sometimes it is, but I would say more often than not, it's an accidental. It's like somebody accidentally leaving a little bit of heat in their fire pit, or the chain thing off the back of the trailer is a big one. Like throwing a cigarette out your window. I don't know how they exactly define that, I think that's just an accidental. I don't think that's necessarily technically arson, but yeah, there's all manner of ways that humans start fires, and there's a lot of prevention measures that are aimed at trying to bring down those ignitions. But I think the fact of the matter is that if you have vast amounts of people living in fire adapted ecosystems, you're going to have ignitions. So regardless of how many, it's important to do that prevention work. I think it's really important that people are talking about putting your fire out completely and dousing it with water and making sure it's cold to the touch, and not throwing cigarettes out your window, and not lighting fireworks when it's bone dry or really at all. I don't know why we're still doing that out west, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Fire started by electrical wiring,
Yeah, that's like
human caused as well.
that's human cause. I would say I think that's human cause. It's like, I would maybe call that like incidental human caused. So, it's still human infrastructure. It wouldn't be identified as natural. And that's like those are like sort of the two big pools. It's like it's either natural or it's human. So yeah, the power line thing is going to continue to be a problem, I think, unless we develop, the ability to utilize technology, like, different technology in a very significant way, very quickly. But yeah. Go ahead.
Another question. Whatcom County is big into bringing in logs. He uses mitigation dead logs, to lay on the forest floor and to allow snags, dead trees to remain standing.
Oh yeah.
Is it a fire hazard?
The dead standing trees? Or,
Yes.
well, I would argue that like clear cutting is not necessarily the most like fire resilient practice that we could be doing. Logging practices in general, when I say thinning, it's like a sort of logging light, they're not taking out the biggest trees, they're taking out some of the smaller trees. But when we have like proper logging going on, I don't know the exact answer to that. I would say, the fire hazard there is just in all the slash that's left over. And then often, I think it's been proven that, these clear cut areas, there's more wind in these areas. So if you do get a fire or an ignition in a clear cut area, there's more open space for the wind to blow, like to fan that a little bit more than in other areas. Does that sort of answer your question? I don't know.
Whatcom County wants me to take dead logs and lay them out in the forest. And
for like habitat?
For the creatures to have.
Oh, for habitat. Yeah.
And, they want me to, if I have a dead tree, they don't want me to cut it down.
Yeah, it's a habitat tree. Well, one dead tree, that's not, I wouldn't say that's any significant risk to, increased fire spread. And, habitat trees are positive. I don't know about the dead and down stuff, like just leaving dead and down trees for habitat. I'm not really sure. I'd say that if kind of like I said earlier, if it's not super dense with other vegetation, maybe it's not too big of a deal. Around here, everything stays pretty wet most of the time. So if we start seeing, these behavior, these preventative measures, or these resilience measures that I'm talking about, might be something we need to start thinking about as we continue to see these bad summers. So like if this summer is equally as bad as last year, then yeah, let's start making some moves towards maybe not having dead and down stuff in the backyard. I don't know though. I don't know. There's always a balance, like with habitat, creating habitat, and creating, doing that when you have only 2 months of extreme fire potential, or maybe 2 weeks of extreme fire potential. It's like, I think they're just probably weighing pros and cons there, and it's hard to say. Go ahead.
We have some questions that came in.
Cool.
One is that we appear to be at less than half our normal rainfall for this time of year. Do you have any predictions? It seems ominous.
Yeah, we are in, I did a fire refresher the other day, and it was one of the images that I saw. It was showing like the drought levels that we're at. And in Western Washington, we were at like yellow. And so, it was white, yellow, orange, red. And so I don't remember the language that they used, but it was like, it is abnormally dry. It's not extremely dry. It's not like to the maximum scary level of drought, but we're certainly drier than we should be. It's hard to say how fire seasons pan out and what contributes to fire seasons being intense or not intense. But from what I understand, it's often a result of what kind of rainfall we get in like May, June, and early July. That's going to kind of that's going to determine just how bad our fire season is towards the end of the summer, is how much rain we get. So like last year, we really got no rain. It seemed like, if I remember correctly, from like June on, maybe even the end of May on. So spring rain is almost more of a definitive marker of how the fire season will go than snowfall is. Because yeah, we're already kind of in a drought right now, and we had a really good winter. We had a lot of snow. But that's not factoring, it's already not really factoring into our drought status. So yeah, we'll be looking for like a lot of rain, hopefully in May and June and early July, to counter the potential prolonged drought impacts later in the summer. Any others from online?
Thank you and praise coming in.
Oh, cool. Oh, well, thanks for putting up with my nerdiness. And yeah, you guys were a great audience. Thanks for being interested, and for all your great questions, and for having me. And keep thinking about fire, and just knowing that it's a thing that happens around here, and that it could happen around here. So yeah, maybe not on the island. I don't know.
We do have our last speaker in the speaker series 2 weeks from tonight. It is Madeline Ostrander, who will be talking about how to find a sense of home when your home is changing or rapidly changing. Thank you very much for coming, and have a great day.